Welcome to part 2 on the tools of motivation process premises that target us psychologically, that get us to go through and change our minds in terms of persuasion. We're talking about 4 process premises. We've already talked about 1, needs, and if you haven't watched that clip, you need to go back and do so. The next one being emotions, the third being attitudes, and the fourth being consistency, or what I call certainty. So this clip is going to deal with the idea of emotions, the process premise of some type of affective consequence that gets us to go through and change our minds about something. And that's pretty fascinating, and it's also extraordinarily manipulative. You can imagine the ethics kind of go out the window when we know that we can use fear, guilt, anger, joy, sadness, not necessarily contempt, I'll come back to that one, but love, to go through and get people to go to do something. Contempt is more of a responsive kind of thing. Here's what these emotions look like, and I'll see maybe if you can't figure this out as we go along and look at each of these. These are students of mine who were interns in a program that I conducted on lying and deception. And there it is. There's the contempt face right there. So emotions can be used to go through and compel us to do things. They can be used manipulatively, if that's a word. They can manipulate us to go through and fall into some level of compliance. They also work very well psychologically in creating certain types of barriers. And I'm talking about negative emotions here that might go through and stand in the way of us being able to reach some level of shared meaning, or actually to compel us to reach a rather unethical level of persuasion. Those barriers include allness, indiscrimination, intentional orientation, and disconfirmation. I'm hoping these sound familiar, especially if you've had interpersonal communication from me, as we talk about how these intercept the ability to reach shared meaning. Excuse me. So let's get into allness. Allness is the idea that if you know 1 or 2 or 3 things about a certain individual, then you know all there is to know about that person. Or if they affect you emotionally in a certain way, if they make you feel love, if they make you feel sadness, if they make you feel angry, then you conclude or assume that you know all there is to know about that individual. And you can see why this becomes a certain barrier, especially in persuasion. It can be used to go through and lump people together. Allness, like this image I have here. I went through and looked up the idea of millennials, and this is one of the images that came up. And I have a family full of millennials. All 5 of our kids would qualify with that kind of label going on. And I'm kind of getting sick and tired of people talking down about millennials. If they think that they know that they were born within a certain time, if they had a certain level of privilege, then they know all there is to know about them. And that's not true. And that stands in a way to go through and create persuasive messages unethically that gets everybody bandwagoning against a certain group of people as a result of that concept of allness. I'm not sure if I've adequately explain that. The next one, to confuse things even more, is this concept of indiscrimination. It's a barrier as well. It's one used to go through and lump a bunch of people together into one main group, ignoring maybe the subtleties of the individuals within that group. I'm fascinated by this as I work with LGBTQ youth. I'm fascinated that within that group or within that label, there's how do I say this? There's a lack of discrimination. And what I mean by that is a lack of looking at the individual person within a specific group. We roll these letters off the tongue like they're all the same people, and they're not. There's a huge discrepancy, in fact, culturally within the LGBTQ community, and I don't know what else to call it because that's become the nomenclature for that. But for example, those individuals who identify as bisexual are not held in the same type of esteem as those who have landed somewhere else along that spectrum of sexuality. Transgenders as well are discriminated against. So indiscrimination means we lump everybody into the same kind of group, and then we don't value them, we don't see them for their individuality. What does this have to do with persuasion? Well, again, like allness, indiscrimination becomes a barrier for us to not appreciate the kinds of differences, and those differences lead to appeals, and those appeals lead to our ability to understand how we are being persuaded to accept or to reject. And in the ethics of this, a lot of anti-LGBTQ indiscrimination behavior leads us to go through and reject an entire group of people based on that indiscrimination. Next is this concept of intentional orientation. And this was just in the news here today. In fact, it was started yesterday. We have a new senator. Her name is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And she was sworn in yesterday. And while she was sworn in, there was a YouTube video that was released of her dancing to the same song that was used in the Breakfast Club. And they tried to go through and intentionally orient her as somebody who is not very smart or not with it, or as a millennial, or whatever the case might be. That intentional orientation kind of backfired because the YouTube video went viral amongst Ocasio-Cortez's fans, and actually upped her acceptance and popularity, and became a real slam to the right-wingers who were trying to go through and smear her or intentionally label her. So intentional orientation is the deliberate process of labeling individuals and then trying to persuade other people about the label. Okay, much like in discrimination and a lot like allness. Okay, all these kind of come together. They're not very mutually exclusive. This one is, though, this idea of disconfirmation. And disconfirmation happens when we persuade people who are bandwagoning to ignore other people, okay? You've had this done to you. Perhaps you've done this to somebody else, where you've disconfirmed, you've ignored the presence of somebody else. William James indicated that no more fiendish punishment could be devised than that one would be turned loose in society and remain unnoticed by the members thereof. And I think there's some validity to that notion there. We have evidence of this kind of behavior. I don't know if you remember this guy by the name of Dylan Klebold, or this guy by the name of James Holmes, or this guy by the name of Adam Lanza. If you don't remember them, maybe this will jog your memory. Or this, the trial after his Aurora, Colorado theater shooting, or this. So these barriers come into play and establish negative persuasive attributes. And if we're not careful with how those barriers are forming certain stereotypes within our own minds, we run the risk of alienating each other. So, and that's an emotional barrier. So as these process premises go, first one being needs, the second one being emotions, the better we understand those, the more we're able to be critical of certain persuasive processes that way. The next one coming up deals with attitudes. If you have any questions, you know where to find me.